Thank you.
Yeah, I'm reading Barack Obama's book. It's incredibly good. Political memoirs are sort of boring, and this isn't. But anyway, that voice, this meeting is being recorded. There's a thing when he's campaigning and the voice comes in, "You're on now." It has been, and they call it the voice of God. Okay. So this is being recorded, sort of the voice of God. Yeah, I want to build on the material we've looked at in terms of hope and strata and the unconscious contribution. But in particular, today I want to talk about our concept of refuge. But before I get into that, I sort of want to put in a bit of background and a bit of the intention of this work. Because one of the claims we make is that the tools are practical and they're precise. There's a lot of precision, a lot of clarity, I believe, in our work. Well, the aim of our work is to have that. But the other, and practicality, above all else, it's practical. Claim I've made all the way along. As well as practical, we have a very solid theoretical framework and cognitive structure. They're all there. But the bit I want to put in here is saying, and I don't quite have the right word for this, and I haven't quite thought about it this way before, but a lot of our work is saying this is what people need in their lives. It is sort of coming from that place. One of the ways that David Pellin sort of touched on that, and he touched on a lot of things that he didn't develop. He just, he was surprisingly clear and contained. And if you look at the film and him as a person, you wouldn't necessarily think that his material would have clarity and be contained, but it is. And he talked about it being preventative. He wanted, and in a way, he didn't want to do the work in prisons, but that was where the need was. But he wanted his work to be preventative. That was his. And coming from that spirit, I really do think there's a part of this work that is, well, to put it simply, telling people what they need in their lives. That's a bit direct. But you need true rest, okay? You need the calm of the pendulum. You need feelings of accomplishment. You need purpose. There is a lot of that. There'd be a more sort of elegant way to put it. But there is a large amount of that element in it. We are, these are the elements that you will need in your life if you're going to be secure, happy, and fulfilled. And if you're not secure and happy and fulfilled, it might be because you do not have these things in your life. And I think in that way, coming back to, the basic metaphor, the basic point of reference of a family, that's what the family does. These are the things you need in your life. That is what parents tell children when it is a nourishing family. And what the topic this evening here, the morning there, is the concept of refuge. And what a refuge is a place where we do not have to prove ourselves, where we can just be ourselves. Like advisors, refuges, and true res, refuge is one of his really sort of simple concepts that in some sense is just obvious common sense. In another sense, it's deep theory and accurate practicality. It had both those qualities. And he defined a refuge as almost a feeling more than a place. And it is the feeling here in this refuge. I don't have to prove anything. I can just be myself. Where he brought that into his work, and as I mentioned last time, it's in the manual in the chapter called Love, Sex, and Affection, because he gave his presentation of a relationship and what and it's titled Love, Sex, and Affection, but he went through love, sex, and affection and established that each of those has a vulnerability to them. They may not last. They can change, or people can change around them. And maybe in the future we'll do a session on relationships. I don't want that to be here now. And he said the thing that holds, he used the word marriage, the thing that holds a marriage together is communication and refuge, not love, sex, and affection. Although love, sex, and affection are often those which start a relationship, their needs which we want met and can be met in a relationship. But his point of view, they are not that which will sustain the relationship or maintain the marriage over time, to use just to channel David's word for a moment. But what it is communication. I can talk to this person where I cannot talk to anybody else. And again, another session here, maybe even a week today, could be on communication, which is also relate to strata, communication strata. But looking here at refuge, and the other, so one was communication, the other was refuge, and, he would say in his particular way, if you've got those, you are giving your marriage the best chance of lasting. So, and that's where he put it. But I have wanted to expand the concepts of refuge. So it's not just in the material around relationships, but it is also more general and relating it to true rest, and also relating it, maybe later in this session, to strata, particularly awareness and perseverance strata, but also social strata, because we need that place where we don't have to prove ourselves. The other thing he talked about it in that material on marriage, which is called Love, Sex, and Affection, and his word marriage. The thing that will maintain a relationship over time is communication and refuge. The thing that will be destructive of a relationship over time is competition. That was just sort of putting those parts of him in there. And as I was talking to Mary, as I mentioned to Mary a couple of days ago, just what an extraordinary mind his was. His material is very unusual. And people who've, studied with me and stayed with me over, a whole bunch of time, it's a fairly easy conversation to have. That, David Pellin had a very unusual mind, and it's like nothing else. You've said at another time, Mary, he sort of came out of nowhere. I've got an image of, I don't know why, not particularly appropriate, but in the movie Paris, Texas, it starts with this man wandering out of the desert as if he's come from nowhere. But there is something about, David's incredibly unusual mind. And, just the things I'm putting out now, love, sex, and affection, that fits in that way. And, competition is the bit that will, bust up a relationship. And then coming into this concept of refuge. And, him saying very, very clearly, communication and refuge will keep your relationship together like nothing else. And, bringing in the connections between the tools, there's something about refuge that almost has the quality, and I guess this is where it can be so important in a relationship, a long-term relationship. It almost creates the atmosphere in which we can turn rejected efforts into accepted efforts. That's sort of there in refuge. And I think for all of us, refuge is a place, but it's a place that we're sharing with others. And I guess as I extend the concept, so it's not just about relationships, I guess refuge will be times we need to have together. It can't always be a refuge, the office or the Zoom meeting or, the organization, the tennis club, the political party, can't always be a refuge, but there will times it needs to be a refuge. just within the, the pressures of people working together. At times there needs to be true rest. And, refuge is simply where we feel we can be ourselves. Now that doesn't always happen in a family. Certainly at times, and we talk about a nourishing family. We just don't put in any family because we don't just say, our basic metaphor is the family. We say the basic metaphor is the nourishing family. Because I guess we don't want to present something that is glossing over that which is evil in life, and there can be evil in a family. There can be, even if not evil, destructiveness. We're talking about a nourishing family where the destructiveness is not there. Mary?
I'm just having some questions as you're talking, like, so what about, myself as a widow, or someone who's single, or someone who's in a marriage that isn't working? Like, is it like, is there a connection with, when people talk about having a safe space inside yourself? Or is it something you feel you can only have with other people, even if the other people are not your significant partner?
Well, again, I'll need to get this part of it a little. I'll need to study up a little bit on part of it. Cynthia.
Well, as you were talking about refuge and stuff, one of the things that I've noticed, and I wonder if this has to do with, and actually even with Mary's question, if it has to do with it, there are some people who I feel more alone with than if I'm actually alone. And I wonder if that has to do with that, sort of like the test, if there's refuge or not.
Spell out what you mean by that.
Like if I'm in a group, actually, a lot of times, actually, it used to be my family, but where you feel like you can't really be you, and you're putting on an act, and if I'm alone, I can just, when you're alone, you can just be yourself. I mean, nobody's looking at you, and I feel, and there's some people who I feel, because I've dealt with loneliness most of my life. But some people I actually don't feel lonely when I'm with. And there's some people who, and I don't necessarily feel lonely when I'm alone, but there are social situations and people I'm with that I feel really lonely when I'm with them. And I'm wondering if that is sort of
you
like
mean that lonely is not a good idea when you're with them?
I don't know how to put it. I just feel more lonely with them than when I'm actually alone.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to describe that any better than that. I don't know. Maybe I don't have the words for it, but that's just the feeling. I'm like in a crowd, or I'm with, a lot of people, and I'm feeling really, really lonely. and I shouldn't feel lonely because I'm with people.
I understand that. Yeah.
And there's some people I don't
sort
feel
of
that way
being
with.
lonely in a crowd is,
yes.
Yeah. So I guess what we're looking at, going back to Mary's question and yours, and the bit I was struggling with, getting Platonic about it, bringing in Plato. Plato, there are ideals, right? The form has an ideal. So, and perhaps that could be useful in Pellin, because there's a sort of ideal of true rest, or ideal of refuge. And it's something we pursue, but may not reach. I just sort of want to bring that in some way, because, this is new, expanding refuge, because refuge has always been just sort of, you know, part of the material on relationships. Okay, that's where it's at. But bring it out into this, into a more general way, and I guess tying it in with true rest, I think that's the way it'll go. Tying it in, I think, just holding them up for half a minute, tying it in a bit with Awareness Strata and Perseverance Strata, because coming, you know, who can we comfortably feel with? I remember seeing a thing, I think it was some sort of celebrity dating program. Actually, someone, I didn't see it, someone told me about it. But there was a very prominent person on it. Her name is Esther Ranson, I remember now. And she was a sort of TV personality, but she had also set up what in England is called Child's Line. She set up Child Line, and Child Line is a telephone line that kids can call if they're being abused. So, you know, everyone in England knows Child Line. Well, yeah, there'd be something similar in America. But anyway, so you're a very substantial lady. And she was on the dating game because she'd been widowed. And she's also a TV personality, and they like going on TV, right? They do. And someone said, I guess the man said, well, we could do these things together. Okay. And she turned around and said, you don't understand. That's not my issue. I got lots of people I could do things with. I want someone who I can do nothing with. And I thought that really, really powerful statement. You know, good for you, Esther. Because I think he was a, pardon Cynthia, but he was a sort of pompous male barrister, okay? He had the legal background. And you know, I don't want some...
No apologies necessary.
Right, I know. But, you know, I'd be a great person to do all these things with. And she just said, I want someone I can do nothing with. And there's something about that that's refuge, isn't it? Someone we can sort of do nothing with. Then, I guess, coming back to Mary's point, if we're on our own, how do we achieve that on our own? How do we create our own refuge? And you know, I have my problems with procrastination and not getting things done, and you know, rejected efforts. Okay, and you know, the home I have, I've just put a whole lot of things into it, from books and plants and art objects, and to make it a place where I can turn rejected efforts into accepted effort. In some ways, it's quite deliberate, okay? So I think there's a connection between refuge and true rest. Just the same as, and I think this is one of the things we get in the tools, and I think it's something that really works because there's variety and flexibility, that some tools are sort of overlap to the point where they're almost the same. Like accepted efforts and feelings of accomplishment is almost the same thing. But I think there's something of being able to just tackle it from different angles makes it work. Mary.
Well, I find myself thinking about something that where a good image maybe is the Russian nesting dolls. It's like thinking back to when I didn't have a sense of refuge and didn't have a sense of self in depression or in a big low. It's like when you are at home to yourself, when you feel your sense of self, You're sitting inside. Like, I have a sense of refuge here that's not just because I've known these people for, you know, over 40 years where I'm staying now. It's partly in a shared higher power belief, slightly different form, but shared. It's partly because I'm sitting inside a purpose. I'm sitting inside accessible feelings of accomplishment. So it's like everything creates that sense of being able to be alone with yourself and have that refuge. Anyway, I'm burbling a bit, but
no, not at all.
It sort of feel, and what's hard and why I like the pairing of hope and refuge is if one's not at home in oneself for whatever reason and hasn't got that source of strength from, you know, purpose reflecting back and feelings of accomplishment nourishing that, or an awareness, whatever your higher power is, then it's hard to believe it exists. And I think one of the values of Pellin tools like Hope and Refuge is saying this does exist, and you may not be sitting in it right now, but it's I know we're developing the material here today in a sense, expanding it from what Dave said, but it's being able to say this is a possibility. like you said, the open, the things people need.
Yes, and I think there's something about it, and if we take it back to, you know, he was saying love, sex, and affection are things that you can that can change, and can be an imbalance between two people, and you can't always tell. You know, people can't always get in balance about those three things. But anyway, not to go into a big digression about that, but we'll address it another time. But I think what he was saying about communication and refuge, they are things you can build directly. You can have control over them, okay? And, you know, and this was work about how do you keep a marriage together? That was essentially the context of his work around this. But I think what he was saying there, you know, is just not the fleeting, but the different times in people's lives when they need love, sex, and affection, and they can change, and they can be seasonal, and they can be out of sync between two people, all those things. But he was saying, you know, communication can build. And what we're looking at today, refuge you can build. And I guess we're saying the same about true rest. You know, it's something that you can go after quite deliberately. And the material we looked at last Wednesday about unconscious contribution, that's harder. I mean, you can do it, but you know, unconscious contribution, if it's destructive or drag, is sort of bad habits. You know, where do they come from? How do you change them? But this other part of the work is something you can deliberately go after. You know, how do I build a refuge for myself? Or how do we build so there'd be two questions here. How do I build a refuge with someone else? And then how do I build a refuge for myself, with myself? And there's so, and what do I want? And then we've got the other elements. You know, how's that going to be a place I can get true rest? How's that going to be a place where I can protect my accepted efforts? How's that going to be a place where I can pursue my purpose? All those things. So I think it's the deliberate possibility of building it. And I think there is something similar about hope. You've sort of got to find a way to hold on to it. And if you can't, or if you can hold on to it, I guess it's important to see, okay, what are the elements that enable me to hold on to hope?
Peter?
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Sorry for my throat.
No.
Two things that sort of going back to what refuge is. First of all, I'd like to give, I think, an example in my life to see if I'm on the right track, which is, so my husband and I have this pattern where I'll be stressed about things because I take everything on, and I'll say, I'm overwhelmed. And he says, do you want me to underwhelm you? And then he will do just the world's dumbest, most obvious magic trick. And I will always laugh, and I will always feel better. And it's just this act of knowing each other and it all being very silly. And that feels like refuge to me. Is that, first of all, just real quick, is that basically on the right track?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah. Hi, Cease. We're just talking about the concept of refuge, okay? That's what today's topic is. Yeah, I think very much. I think there's a place in long-term relationship marriages where just using your word, silly might be the most important thing that happens, okay? And obviously that's an exaggeration, but I think there's probably something about a nourishing family and something about refuge where you can tell dumb jokes and people will laugh and put up with you. Okay, I think I'm just sort of throwing that out as the silliness, the lightness, I guess making mistakes. When it hasn't come out very much on the forum, but it's very much in my writings in different places, that we really take we really take and like cliches, the cliches that come out of common sense, and I think there is something about refuge where you can burn the pasta raw, spill the milk, and don't cry over spilt milk. I think there's a certain, and that of course has got a whole lot of unconscious contribution underneath it. But I think that silliness is, I think it'd be almost a tip-off in a lot of places. And I think it's also can be seen very clearly in, it's using the tools, and as we get into them, they need to be able to be light, because, evaluation strata sounds heavy. But when in a family, there is too much teasing, okay? And sort of really not using evaluation. And too much teasing can be quite destructive, really quite destructive. So it's almost the other side of humor, isn't it? Kind of negative around the positive. And I guess the difference between being silly and having the teasing that does cut, okay, that does cut. Yeah, a cruel nickname. I mean, I guess a cruel nickname is one of the characteristics of bullying. So I think, so I think silliness works in terms of refuge.
Now, my other question that I had is what happens to a person when they don't have refuge?
Well, in this material, one of the ways we'd say they're in trouble, okay? One of the ways you can look at it is that, they could take to a destructive pattern. Drugs, booze, too much television, too much food. Because I think when someone doesn't have, I think the need for a refuge is so fundamental. And I reckon it could go back in terms of memory links all the way back to our beginnings, which I go back 30,000 years in my writing, my audacity. I think when someone doesn't have a refuge in our terms, it's making a bit, anyways, using the tools a lot today. I think there's almost nothing to stop the attraction to hurt. So if there's not refuge in a relationship, people will fight. If there is refuge, I think the fights can be put aside. If we take that, because I don't know if you remember, but the material around refuge going way back for you and I, in terms of you organizing Pellin workshops in Ohio and running the Pellin North American office. When I did workshops on love, sex, and affection, that was Dave's material on relationships. And it was that love, sex, and affection may not last over time. And what you need is communication and refuge. That's just sort of, going over what we said earlier tonight. And yes, you excuse this digression, but see, I can literally see in front of me the leaflet we had for that workshop and the illustration on the cover. It's going back a long way. Anyway, just to fill it in, and that's where David introduced his material on refuge, a place where you can just be yourself. And the thing that holds a relationship together over time is communication and refuge. So I'm taking refuge out of just that context and relating it to hope, relating it to more general situations. I just wanted to, place you in that context, East. So I think, one of the things I said earlier, the fact that so much of our work is preventative, and that one of the characteristics of it, we sort of tell people, and I guess you could say it's didactic, I guess you could say it's a bit assertive at times. that we're telling people what they need in their life. And, you know, a lot of therapies would say you can't do that. You just got to facilitate. And we're saying, no, you need refuge in your life. And if you are, if you don't have it, coming back to your point, Elizabeth, I don't want to wander too far away from your question. Yeah, if someone doesn't have refuge in their life, I think that's something to notice, see where it could work out, and sort of how important it is. I mean, you know, some of the most ambitious work I've done over the last 5 years, and still working on, is adapting the tools so they can be directly taught to foster children, because children in their birth family get unconscious contribution, get taught all sorts of things on an unconscious contribution level that foster kids don't get. So kids in their ordinary family, even if it's not that nourishing a family, they're still going to have refuge. And, you know, foster kids are often kids that reports are written about. You know, they don't automatically get refuge. It'd almost be a distinction between the good foster families and then the ones that aren't good. Elizabeth.
It occurs to me that one thing refuge does is sort of cut the outside world down to size, if that makes sense.
No, that makes total sense. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, I'm reading Barack Obama's book, The Promised Land. And on the campaign, and using my word, they would find ways to get true rest, to find a refuge, okay? Even if it was you know, just some scruffy place and some scruffy time. And I think at those times, and he you know, he writes very personally in his book. So it's a good read for me on that level. And I think that's what happened, exactly what you said happened, okay? At those times, you know, the pretension of what they were doing, the size of what they were doing was just sort of cut down to size, okay? And I think there's something in a refuge. And again, we defined it as a place where we can just be ourselves, or we don't have to compete. You know, I can just be and I guess it almost comes back to the bit about being silly. You know, being silly, being light. No. You really think you're going to be president of the United States? Let's all have a beer. Cease.
Yeah, I wanted to say Elizabeth is really on track with that strategy. And I think you were too years ago. And I don't know if you're familiar with Gottman, Gottman, the couple. This is one of the big strategies they talk about in couples that—
No, I don't know. I don't know them. I thought it was somebody else. Sorry.
Oh, they're the big marriage counseling researchers.
Yeah.
And what they found was that the every couple fights in some way or other, maybe not verbally or, you know, But one of the big strategies that seemed to be working for healthy couples was exactly what Elizabeth was saying, was humor. And if they could, you know, they might fight for a while and then somebody would make a funny remark and they'd be, it would kind of break the ice. And there were some others that worked too, but that was really an eye opener for me, that was considered a big strategy. And there were some others too, but I wanted to support that. If I cannot, when I'm upset, I can't always think of something funny, but but I like that strategy. Thank you for bringing it up, Elizabeth.
I just thought of something from my experience as a divorce lawyer, and actually somewhat as an astrologer working with couples sometimes. But one of the things, I guess, going into social strata, I think there are times, and it's where one person is actually getting refuge, but that is like crowding out the other person's refuge. And I think it's not always the case, but it's more often the man who's getting it and the woman who's not, because she's doing all the accommodation and like changing herself. And I've noticed this in couples there, and it's happened. It doesn't. It more often happen this way than the other way around. Although I guess maybe that's sometimes when men will cheat, that had to do that with that as well. But the man would have absolutely no idea what was wrong with the woman and why she wanted a divorce and what she was upset about. and I think in a lot of those cases, you know, and if I happen to be representing the woman and having him talk to the woman, a lot of times it's because he's just not she's not able to be herself, or she's not able to, and he doesn't seem to notice or care. It does go both ways, but it's just more common. And it's, so I don't know, that's just something that I wanted to bring up. And
no, I think that's
mind.
Yeah, I think that's really relevant, because I guess if you can't speak your mind, you can't be yourself, right? And I wonder how, I mean, I think you could be interesting sort of analysis. And Mary.
Well, what Cynthia just said brought very strongly a memory of a mixed workshop when I was at university, before I even met you, or just after university. And it was a workshop of men and women together. And this is about women finding their voice when it was very new, you know, the beginning of the women's movement. And we had one session where the men were in a room together and the women were in a room together. And using this term, it was about what refuge did you have in your different groups. I can't remember what the instruction was, but what happened to the women was we created this fantasy island, I think it was, where we were all together and we were all, you know, had this amazing time and we felt so nourished by each other. And the men were in the other room, literally sulking. They didn't want to try and find a refuge together. I mean, I don't mean they did it consciously, but they were very disgruntled after this session because the nourishment the women gave them, it was mostly couples, but not only, because I wasn't in a couple, the nourishment they were used to getting to create their sense of refuge was suddenly taken away, and they didn't know how to find it with each other or even on their own. So that popped in rather vividly.
Yeah, no, I think it relates to, you know, David's point, which I mentioned earlier here, that what is destructive in a marriage is competition. Okay, now, in a workplace, et cetera, you got to have competition goes with the territory. So I don't know where all that goes, but I think the situation you were describing, I guess there's something loose, there's something silly about a real refuge. It's not all it is. It can also be very deep. And I guess the men sort of, it sounds if couldn't handle because I remember those times and the struggles of those times, and men could often talk the, use another expression, talk the talk but not walk the walk. So I think that's relevant. And, you know, going back to my current reading, and, you know, I think this is probably going to be analyzed for a very long time. You know, going to be a lot of history books. But the power of Michelle Obama being able to say, you know, I hate politics. Okay. I mean, if you sort of analyze that, she says it, that's the deal, guys. Or that's the deal, Barack. And anyway, I'm just saying it's worth analyzing because I think it almost, you know, opens up the lightness, the silliness, because the heaviness is stated. I guess that's it. Somehow the heaviness needs to be stated. And I think the particular situation you're talking about, Mary, the heaviness could not be stated, and maybe it wasn't even understood. But, you know, but her statement, you know, I hate politics. It just gets the heaviness out there, doesn't it? It's not sort of hidden away.
If she hadn't hated politics, she might have been harder to create the refuge. There's clearly a presidency where there was a refuge.
Yes, yeah.
Can I go back? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, go.
Well, I was just thinking earlier when you were sort of slightly apologetically saying about being didactic and saying what people need. I was thinking about how important that is, because the prevalence of most therapies being inside emotional strata and saying, well, you get better by looking at the problems.
Mm.
And how universal that is. And, you know, I'm not saying there aren't any exceptions, and maybe there's some exceptions in somatic psychology or something like that. But in the popular mind, anyway, as well, of therapists and people, it's, well, let's look at the problems. And it's so relevant, you know, it's so relevant to my history. You know, you saw that I had a potential to make a contribution in an area of that I didn't even know I had any. You know, I didn't understand the caring life force, and you knew I needed purpose. And I remember just telling someone the other day, this was a bit harsh, it was a bit of the times, but the one time I was hospitalized, which was after I knew you, I don't know if you remember this, but you and Claire were upset with me because I could have used my performance life force to go out and do street theatre. And I couldn't because I was too out of it. I wouldn't have been able to do that. But obviously, you know, it was looking at it through that prism of, in the long run, it came true that there were ways I could make a contribution rather than having a breakdown. And I suppose I'm just highlighting what you just said in action.
Say the last bit again. It froze from
Oh, sorry. I said, I suppose I'm just highlighting the power of that, looking at what someone needed.
Yes, I think there is.
40 years ago, even in a humanistic psychology context that we were in, as opposed to a medicalized context, there's still, I think it was still looking at the problems, wasn't it? You know, primal scream was, and, you know, still problems soaked. So, you know, I think it's a pretty lone trail, and of looking at what the positives of what people need, and not really trumpeted. So I think we have to do the trumpeting.
No, I think you're
just
right.
support.
And it was a surprise for me, after all this time, and thinking, hey, what about looking at it this way? And that is, one of the things we do is tell people what they need. And in terms of what you do, which I appreciate, because inside myself, I was too apologetic, okay? I was tripping over myself. I just should have said, this is what we do. But then I do think we need some way to simply articulate it. We're not the only people doing that, but some particular, Cynthia.
Sorry, my cursor wasn't working real well to unmute. Well, actually, in terms of like with the medical model, one of the things in terms of traditional, I'm talking about traditional before 200 years ago or 300 years ago, you're supposed to do, it's a difference between homeopathy and the medical model today. And homeopathy means something very different than it's, now it's used to be more new agey. But the idea is that you heal with like, and basically what you're doing is like even down as far as Hippocrates and stuff, the idea is that unless the situation was dire, your goal was to support somebody's physical strength, and your goal
Yes,
was to
yes,
give them what you
yeah,
need, and you only resorted to attacking
yeah,
when things had gone so far and you had to do it
mm,
dangerous, because homeopathy was both safer but it worked slower, whereas I think antipathy would work faster, but it was more dangerous. So you only resort to, and now the medical community, I mean, modern medicine goes straight to that before you even consider supporting somebody's health. It's all, I mean,
yeah.
they're changing now with some wellness models, but that idea is you, and I think that's what happens with modern psychology, or at least that's my frustration.
No, I that's probably true. Because I read a lot of historical novels, and I read a very good historical novel that was set. I'm trying to think. Just before the decline of the Roman Empire, so that's anyway, way back then, and it was a young woman who wanted to be a doctor, and they wanted a prominent family, and they were in Greece, and she wanted to be a doctor. So she ran away from her family and the proposed marriages, disguised herself as a young man, and studied medicine in Alexandria. It's a very good historical novel. And that was touching on a lot of the things you were saying then. It was quoting the Greek definitions of what medicine was. And those things you were saying now were what were there. Okay, what were there. And somehow or other that got lost. Do you want to comment at all, Tamara?
I had a thought. I was, for some reason over the holiday, it felt like it had to be about Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole and Katharine Hepburn. The perfect movie, by the way, for the holiday is A Lion in Winter.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, all families have their ups and downs, is what Katharine Hepburn says, is they're all trying to kill each other for the throne. But Richard Burton, in an interview, was asked, he had 3 homes, one in the States, one in Wales or England, and one in Switzerland, and asked him where his home was, what he considered his home to be. And he said, wherever my books are.
Okay.
And the interviewer asked him again, and he said again, where my books are. And he really meant it. And when I think the marriages, survive all of these losses of what you say maybe you have for a time. What is it in, anyway, that was one thought I had. And I know that for myself, true rest, ideas of true rest, hope, and refuge are really, really big. And you start knocking on that door, and it's pretty goddamn interesting to notice, like, if it's gone missing, when did I lose it, and how come, and how do I get that back? But I also was thinking about what you were saying about that the death for a marriage, it's communication and refuge that's most needed, but that competition can be a real downfall there. And I was wondering about competition. But I know that working with couples, I'm really struck, and I don't know if it's where I live or you know, the population that I work with, but there's so much comparing that it feels maybe it's competition, but it feels more like disastrous sort of comparing that's almost more sibling-like. Like I did the
Mr. Wording, say that again.
Sibling. Like, you know, I did the laundry last time, it's your turn. I did the dishes last time, it's your turn. Well, I watched the kid, it's your turn. It's everything's supposed to be 50-50, fairsies. But it's really insane. I mean, it really is like everything splits down the middle, halvesies, perfect. And it feels to me like it's two kids still in a schoolyard that haven't taken on adult ideas yet. And then Robert Bly wrote a book called Sibling Society about American, that there are no adults.
That's nice.
Very few adult couples, you know, so when you're reading about Obama and Michelle, whatever, but the idea of, I think that in some ways we're just abandoned to know how to grow into something that's richer, who offers guidance in that way to people in relationship, you know? That was about it. Yeah.
Yeah, Kazantzakis wrote an essay. You know, he's the guy who wrote, most famous for writing Zorba the Greek.
Zorba the Greek?
He wrote Zorba the Greek.
Oh shit, there's another movie for the holiday. I totally want to check that one out again.
Yeah. But anyway, he wrote an essay which was influential on me, where he said, well, one I mentioned here before, but he wrote an essay which was essentially saying the sort of human race is at the adolescent stage of development. You know, we're sort of brilliant, energetic, mindlessly destructive. You know, we are not mature, we are adolescents.
Yeah.
And that's similar to what you're saying.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I identify myself as an aspiring adolescent.
Yeah.
I'm right around, I may be around the time of launching and individuation by the time I die.
Am I too old to be able to make that claim, I wonder? I think I'm fishing for a compliment, okay? Sometimes I fish for compliments.
Where did I fuck up? Where did I go wrong? Who let me down? It's like, why didn't the culture tell me? I'm gonna have to go shopping or starve.
I think
nobody took care of it. It's not like I don't know. I just think I'm in a magic bubble that, what the I didn't know how to build. Nobody, and I've been in therapy since I was 8. So this is a cautionary tale. This is the limitations of the field I'm in. Just look at me.
Yeah, well, that's it.
We need Pellin for sure.
Yeah, But that's the other one that I guess Elizabeth's point of, a refuge is something that might cut us down to size. The other thing that Kazantzakis wrote that I mentioned that this one on the forum about this sort of young man who was sort of had dreams, and he worked as a carpenter, and they're very close to his mom and dad, but he felt he was sort of getting these voices, and someone was telling him, he's the son of God. And so he went to a therapist, and the therapist helped him through his delusions of grandeur, and Jesus of Nazareth disappeared from history because he had a good therapist. Okay. So,
Small correction as to the point I was making. I was saying it's not us that gets cut down to size. It's the outside world that gets cut down to size.
Yeah,
because refuge comes with the assumption that we're good enough.
Yeah. No, refuge does come with the assumption that we're good enough. And I guess that does take us back to the nourishing family and how the nourishing family works, and all the ways that a nourishing family unconscious contribution just builds up that feeling you're good enough, Cynthia.
That brings me to something that I was thinking about. And I think one of the things in marriages in particular that cuts down the idea of refuge is when one partner thinks that they're going to change the other partner. And like I don't know, this is not just one time I've heard this. I used to hear this all the time. It was almost like, what they call it, a trope now. When it was often, I'd be talking to the woman and she'd say, well, I know what he's going to do because that's what he did to his ex-wife while I was dating him. And I'm just scratching my head. It's like, um, and his ex-wife, that was when he was still married to her, and they were going through a divorce. And just like, the idea is 9 times out of 10, the main problem with the marriage was known about. And a lot of times, like with him, well, particularly if he was real controlling around money, he would say, yeah, I know she spends a whole lot. She did that before I married her. And like they knew what the problem was, but they had some sort of fantasy that this was going to change when they got married, so that's my kind of premarital advice. If I ever talk to somebody, if something bothers you before you're married, it's going to bother you tenfold once you get married. So but anyway, sorry, I don't know if that went off track, but that
No, not at all. And that's where it's communication and refuge. Cease?
Oh, I just thought that was hilarious what you just said.
Yeah.
Very obvious that we have blinders on when we're like in love.
Yeah.
Oh, it happened with me because I'm so good and all that stuff. Yeah, that's hilarious. I didn't have anything to add, but I do have to go. So I'll see you all on Wednesday.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see you, Cease.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So we got a few minutes. I think there's an interplay between Perseverance Strata and Refuge. I think refuge in some form or other is almost sort of crucial to survival at times. And then I think awareness strata, I think, feeds into refuge. I think people who have a healthy awareness strata probably can almost rather naturally just sort of find refuge, or find refuge, build it, protect it.
I was just thinking that when you have refuge in a relationship, it's an intimate relationship, it's something that's more than the two people. Maybe just suggesting this, which is what you get with a higher power that works for you, you know, Richard Burton's books or Your History of Politics or A Sense of God. It's like it's still a place in which you can find refuge, and it's more than the individual. I don't know if that's right about, you know, in couples work they talk about the third, the couple is like a third thing from the two individuals. I'm thinking a bit like that.
No, I think that's similar, and I think the story about Richard Burton and his books, I think, gives a sense of refuge just in you telling the story, Tamara. You know, this hugely talented and tortured man. And then you say, my books, and then he repeats it again. When my books are, you get the feeling of, okay, you know, talented to the point of genius and tortured in a way that took his life too young. But you get this sense of, yeah, his books. You almost got the sense that even in the telling of the story, gave a sense of what refuge is. Okay, I guess we're ending there for today.
I just wanted to say I don't this may be for another time, but I don't understand the relationship to Perseverance Strata that you mentioned.
Oh, if we have refuge, that gives us a place to maintain or pull up our perseverance strata so we can keep going. And that way it relates to hope. And the example I've used here before is the Italian film La Vita Buona, I think it's called, of the family, including the young boy and father, who go into the concentration camps. And the father creates a sense of refuge in the concentration camp. So the boy survives. He's 5, 6. And he's, as I've said, you know, the film is stark and realistic and also a fairy story all at once. But, you know, the father convinced the boy it was all a game. And all they had to do was survive. I think that's where the perseverance strata and refuge come. That was the example I was thinking of when I put those two together.
Thank you. That's much clearer.
Yeah. And I guess you could take another one and use the, use it just directly. A family who ICE is going after them and they're in a church and they're going to stay in the church and they can't be arrested and deported. So I think that's almost a straightforward example of refuge. It's been around for centuries. a church is a place where you take refuge and can't be arrested and can't be deported.
Describes it nicely, to be a refugee.
Yes, yeah, refugee, right? Someone looking for a refuge. And hope, I guess, is sitting out 23 days, isn't it? Yeah, I agree, Cynthia. Okay, we'll end there. Just end with a little round. I'm Peter, I'm in King's Lynn. Yeah, thanks for coming. I want to do more with this part of the material. Do you want to go next, Elizabeth?
Sure. I'm Elizabeth. I'm in Eugene, Oregon. I've had a lot of fun this time looking at a source of health and strength in my life, improving to the point where my husband and I had a fight maybe a week ago where we traded a couple of really nasty verbal blows, then just looked at each other and said, how about we not? And I think it's because of the refuge that we've built that we were able to do that. That's all.
Elizabeth,
Okay,
what did
thanks.
you say to each other? I couldn't catch the words.
Oh, how about we not? We, just in the middle of this sort of nasty verbal battle, just decided to drop our weapons.
Okay.
Tamara?
I'm Tamara in San Francisco, and I would love to revisit this again in the forum. Yeah. Thank you.
Cynthia?
Hello. I'm Cynthia. I'm in Kankakee, and actually, I don't know if this is something that I may need to do some work around, and about where I do get refuge and where I don't, and so it's good to think about.
Okay, Mary?
I'm Mary in Rosarito Beach. And can you stay on after we stop the recording? Because there's a housekeeping thing about what we do when, forum-wise.
Who are you?
Okay.
Oh.
I guess we can stop the recording.
Okay, bye-bye.